You know, I've missed each one of you. We took a little break and I actually had this separation thing going on. It's like, where are my people at? And so I was looking forward to today and seeing all your faces again. I don't think I have ever been so emotionally attached as I am now. It's like my family is big, and you happen to be it with my wife. So everybody, welcome to a new year, to a new set of discoveries. You have no idea what's coming your way, either do I, but I'm praying for the best. So welcome to a new talk series.
Thank you, McFinn. What a beautiful way to start things off. I have to echo that same sentiment. It's been a little bit weird not having you guys around for the holiday season, but we are going to be starting off 2023 very strong. Everything ALS has big plans, and we are excited to take you on this roller coaster. We wanted to show you a quick overview of what 2022 is like, and then we won't delay anything. We'll get Amelie right up to bat, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully let me know if you can hear this. Let's see here.
No. Okay, there it is.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh,
need sound.
that would be me. Can you not hear?
No. Sound. We need sound.
Lots of calls for enrollment in neuroscience, and the reason is because neuroscience recently spoke at Everything ALS. It got the word out about their exciting trial, so it really shows the power of this amazing group to help help recruitment so that we can get answers to whether a drug works or not faster. So thank you for that.
I have the greatest respect for you and for your organization. I think this is such an awesome way to do research, this sort of crowdsourcing that you're doing. I love, the fact that there's no barriers to people participating. And I love just the apolitical dissemination of information. I mean, whoever wants to come and listen and talk about this, I love this.
Studies like this one that will find the key, or at least to earlier diagnosis.
I am part of the VOICE study, trying to determine when it starts to change because of ALS. Pataka, pataka, pataka.
To go in there and then to do the I'll leave myself in there.
So I hope you guys all feel the energy that I do right now. Sorry about that. I hope all of you feel that same energy, that same drive to really do something to move the needle. And Everything ALS is doing our best to do that. So we have a growing team of data scientists, of neurologists, of amazing advocates, and we're here for you. So one, if you're interested in any of our studies, we have a speech study and a multidisciplinary study, which is completely remote and at home. So if you are walking unassisted, please reach out to myself, reach out to Grace, take a look at our www.everythingals
Chilly. I'm getting a
/research
blanket.
and,
Are you?
and go
You're
ahead
warm enough for that?
and put your information in, and I'll be reaching out to you. If you're interested in the speech study, it's just a 20-minute commitment once a month. And so reach out to Grace, reach out on our research tab, and we'll get you hooked up. Otherwise, please reach out to us for any other questions. I'm going to pass it off to Grace to introduce our amazing speaker today.
Hello, everybody. I am Grace. I'm a research fellow here with Everything ALS, and tonight I am so excited to be here with all of you, welcoming the new year. And I'm so excited to also introduce our incredible speaker, Dr. Amelie Gubitz. Dr. Amelie Gubitz is a program director in the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, NINDS, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. At NINDS, she oversees a research grant program focused on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and other rare neuromuscular diseases. Dr. Gubitz earned her Ph.D. in pharmacology from the University of Cambridge in the UK and performed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School and the University of Pennsylvania. She's also worked as a senior scientist in a target discovery group for neuropathic pain at a biotech company in the UK, and as a research assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied spinal muscular atrophy. So if you have any questions throughout Dr. Gubitz's presentation, please write them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. But now, without further ado, Dr. Amelie Gubitz, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to give a seminar today. So I'm going back to screen sharing. Okay. All right, so I hope everybody can see this. I don't know about this little window up here. Okay, that's disappearing now. Great. So I already got, a brief introduction, but just to let you know, so as a program director, I oversee our investment in ALS research, but everything at NINDS and I think at NIH in general is very collaborative. So there are a number of my colleagues who help me with our ALS research investments and in overseeing them, and it includes some colleagues from our clinical division. So it's a neurologist, Lumi Savaki-Adams, helps me. And I also have colleagues in our therapy development division and in my team at the Division of Neuroscience, Jane Hettinger. And I think she is tuning in today. She's also helping me with this task, which I think is really helpful for us because we have sort of a really steep increase of ALS investments over the past few years. So there are more activities, more work to do. So it's really good to have additional hands on deck. Not moving forward. No, I haven't had that problem. It won't allow me to, let me try again. Oh, maybe here. Okay, perfect. So for my talk today, I just want to sort of discuss 4 different interconnected topics. So initially, I just want to give you an overview about NIH funding of ALS research, and you'll see a lot of dollar figures and grant numbers. And I'm also going to highlight a few programs and grants that we are currently funding. And then I'm going to talk about ACT for ALS implementation. So as you probably all know, this legislation is very important to the field. And we're just starting 2 of ACT for ALS. Then I'm also going to talk about the NIH ALS strategic plan that has been ongoing over the last year, and we're just about to wrap it up. And this was sort of a community effort, by researchers, clinicians, and also people affected by the disease and advocates. And I hope that some of you have been following this. And I think I saw Ellen Phillips, who actually is on the steering committee of the strategic plan. And finally, that's just one slide. I'm going to very briefly talk about a study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine on ALS. And they're going to develop recommendations for ALS research, care, and services. And I should say this is very much related also to the strategic planning effort at NIH, but it's a little bit broader because it's also trying to develop recommendations for care services for patients. Okay, I have to. So this slide is very colorful, and this is a screenshot from the public NIH Reporter website. You can easily get to it, just Google NIH Reporter, and it's a very content-rich website that describes NIH investments in all of its mission areas. And you can do a lot of data mining on this website, but one segment of the website that I really like is called categorical spending. You can see that here. And if you click on this link, then you get a very large table of research spending of NIH that is organized in over 300 different research programs and diseases. And I should say there are, of course, many more than 300 human diseases. So not every disease is listed and has a slot, but fortunately ALS is listed and is reported. And I think it gives a lot of transparency about the research that NIH is funding in the space of ALS research. In the bottom here, you see, I sort of pulled out ALS. It's a very long table. You have to scroll to ALS, but it's early in the alphabet, so it's easy to get to. And here you can see the funding numbers since 2014, but there's also data that goes further back. And right now, we are just closing fiscal year 2022, and you can see that NIH spent $124 million on ALS research, and about 10% of that amount is for our intramural labs. And as I mentioned, and we talked about earlier, there are a couple of very high quality labs at ALS that focus on ALS research. Brian Traynor comes to mind, Mike Ward, and also Kurt Fischbeck and Chris Grunzreich. They do really excellent research. And about 90% of that amount goes to universities and other research organizations across the country who conduct ALS research, and we even fund a few foreign universities. So giving you a little bit of sense of, how things have developed over the last 10 years, I wanted to show you the numbers since 2011. And that actually coincides with the time when I started my role as a program director for ALS research. And as you can see, there has been a very sort of steady increase in our investment in ALS research. And I think that reflects sort of really strong energy in the research community and also very exciting research opportunities. So back in 2011, we had a research portfolio of about $44 million, and now it's at around $120 million. And I think once we sort of put in the numbers from ACT for ALS, that bar will grow even further. And on the right here, sorry. I hope you can see that pie chart. So that has a lot of acronyms, but what I wanted to show here is that at NIH, which is a large organization with 27 different institutes and centers, actually a number of them contribute to our ALS research investments. So the biggest funder of ALS research is Neurology, NINDS. So that's the institute that employs me. So we fund about half, or a little bit over half of ALS research. But there are some other contributors that actually do really important work. So for instance, NIDCD, that's the acronym for the National Institute of Deafness and Communications Disorders. So they have a couple of really interesting research grants that focus on bulbar dysfunction and speech in ALS. And then an NCATS, that's another acronym up here. So that's the National Center for Advancing translational sciences. So they fund a very large clinical consortium together with us. So it's a one-on-one collaboration between NINDS and NCATS. And these partnerships are really important for us because they bring different expertise to these types of research areas. And NIA also has a pretty big slice of the pie. That is the National Institute of Aging. They fund quite a bit of ALS research, although it's quite of an interesting arrangement. The grants they fund are often administered by my institute. And the area that they are particularly interested in is the overlap between amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and then frontotemporal degeneration, which is a dementia disorder. And some of that research is actually funded by Alzheimer's money because it's a dementia. So that has sort of helped, advance additional ALS FTD research project. And I think that's, again, a growing collaboration as we learn more about the sort of disease continuum between ALS and FTD and the shared genetic causes, the shared pathologies, and also sort of the overlapping symptomatology. So these are all the numbers for fiscal year 2021. I use that as my example because these numbers are locked in, the books have closed, and pretty soon we can update that with the numbers for fiscal year 2022. They'll be some, quite similar, but there's a little bit of an increase, and hopefully we'll continue to see that growth in 2023. So I wanted just to give you a few examples of some of the programs that we are funding that I'm quite excited about. So the so-called Accelerating Leading Edge Science in ALS program, or in short, we call it ALS Squared. That's a program that we started in fiscal year 2021. And we put a solicitation for these grants to specifically incentivize high risk and high reward ALS research. And sometimes these really high risk research endeavors, they're a little bit hard to get funded. Peer reviewers are sometimes a little bit more conservative. So we collaborated with the NIH Common Fund. I call it NIH Central. They have a program for high risk, high reward research. So we asked them to put an angle to that program to specifically solicit ALS research. And in response to that solicitation, we are now funding 4 pretty big team science projects. One is at the University of Pittsburgh, the Mayo Clinic Jacksonville, and the Broad Institute, which is part of MIT up in Boston. So you can see that's a really nice collaboration. And the goal of this project is to take a deep dive in the molecular composition of tissue that is affected in ALS and FTD. And they're using brain and spinal cord postmortem tissue for this really in-depth analysis that is using very cutting edge technologies. Another really nice collaboration is in New York City between Columbia University and New York University. And they're looking at the biophysical properties of cells in tissues affected by ALS. So again, spinal cord and motor cortex, and they're trying to figure out whether macromolecular crowding triggers protein aggregation, which is seen in tissue in ALS patients. And they're using some really sort of innovative strategies and looking both inside cells and then also in the cell environment, sort of in the tissues. For instance, they're looking at edema. So that's a pretty innovative project. Another one is a therapy development project at East Carolina University. And that team is sort of looking at a novel therapeutic paradigm that is trying to restore cellular balance and homeostasis. And they're looking both in ALS and in Alzheimer's disease and have sort of a combinatorial approach. And finally, the last project I'm also very excited about, that's out of the university in Michigan. And they are looking at environmental exposures that may play a really important role as a risk factor for ALS. And specifically, they're looking at the interactions between environment and then genetic, epigenetic, metabolomic, and immune features in people affected with ALS. So I think it's really sort of interesting and innovative collaboration. Okay, so moving on. So another program that I wanted to highlight, that's a clinical study. and that is the Create Consortium out of the University of Miami, although I should say they have sites across the US, so it's a pretty sort of big geographical enrollment. And Create stands for clinical research in ALS and related disorders for therapeutic development. And the related disorders that they're also including in the study are primary lateral sclerosis, hereditary spastic paraplegia, and some other ALS-like syndromes. But I should say the main focus is ALS, so that's sort of the biggest cohort of patients they are enrolling. And the lead investigator is Michael Beneter at the University of Miami. And I always sort of wanted to know him. I asked him, how would you describe the objective and goals of this program? And he said, it's very simple. We are trying to overcome roadblocks to therapy development. Of course, that isn't simple and has a lot of complexities. And as all of you sort of appreciate, there are a lot of knowledge gaps in ALS. So for instance, the causes of the disease are not well understood, and also the way the disease progresses. It starts, in one part of the brain and spinal cord, but then have a gradual progression across the whole body. Then ALS also looks very different in different patients. So we call it basically the variable phenotypes or clinical heterogeneity. So that is also not really well understood. And there are certainly limitations with the clinical outcome measures that are currently used in therapeutic trials. I guess all of you are quite familiar with the ALS rating scales, functional rating scale, but I think we can do a lot better. There is, increasing interest in remote outcome measures. I really like the fact that some of you are participating in voice recording studies. I think there are a lot of opportunities there, and there are probably a lot of sort of app-based strategies that we want to adopt in the field. There's also still a paucity of biomarkers. I think there has been quite a bit of progress, but we're not quite at the finishing line. And we need these biomarkers to help us as sensitive readouts, either for the diagnosis of the disease, because that certainly takes too long, or as sensitive readouts in clinical trials to complement the clinical outcome measures and maybe give us earlier signals that help us know whether a drug is working or not. Then another, I think, really important goal is to increase engagement of people living with the disease in clinical research and clinical trials. And of course, people living with the disease often want to participate in these studies, but there are a lot of logistic hurdles, and they're working to figure out how this can be streamlined. And then another really important goal is to try to accelerate diagnosis so that interventions can start earlier, because the status quo right now is that treatment for ALS patients is often initiated too late. And there is very good data suggesting that early treatment is going to be more effective. So ALS, the Create Consortium is conducting a whole range of clinical studies, and they include biomarker studies, they include genome studies. They're also funding a whole range of imaging studies, and they're also now funding a few studies to better understand the time of phenoconversion of those who have genetic mutations that put these people at a very high risk of developing the disease. And to implement these study goals, they are enrolling participants across the country at over 10 different sites, and they also have 3 international sites. And over the course of the study, they have enrolled over 500 patients. I have to say, I think Create has been active for about 8 years, and patients will participate in the study, but then also they'll sort of rotate out and other patients will come. But all the data is being captured and accumulated, and it's a very sort of rich data source that they're very willing to share with the community to enable meta-analyses with other studies. I should say that other sort of interesting aspects of the studies is that they also fund a small career enhancement core. This is very important to NIH because we feel that it's really important to fund the next generation of ALS researchers, especially ALS clinician scientists. We always want to think ahead of the future, and we certainly want a robust workforce of scientists, especially those with clinical knowledge, to in the future continue advancing ALS research. Then they also have a really sort of sophisticated genomics core and a outreach and advocacy core to engage with advocacy groups. A number of them are involved, and they also fund this pilot project program to fund smaller studies, often by junior investigators, to collect pilot data, which then enable these investigators to submit bigger and better funded NIH research grants. Okay, so moving on. So another sort of area of increased interest at NINDS is to better understand the interaction between genetics and exposome. And so, as you know, all of you are aware of that some forms of ALS are inherited. And for these forms, there have been a lot of advances. And with all these very sophisticated genomics technologies, we now know that there are over 30 gene mutations that either cause ALS or at least are very strong risk factors. And some of these genetic variants are also thought to play a role in sporadic ALS. And an example is, for instance, the repeat expansion mutations in the gene C9orf72. However, for the majority of ALS cases, we still don't really understand the causation and the triggers. And there is an expectation that it's an interplay between genetics and exposome. And the exposome, these are non-inheritable factors that are involved in neurological diseases like ALS or Parkinson's disease, or also Alzheimer's disease. And the exposome are either exogenous factors, such as environmental risk factors, but then also ecosystems, could be socioeconomic factors, education, things like that. And then on the other hand, there also are behavioral risk factors, such as stress, or perhaps lifestyle issues, things like that. And then these are also involved along with endogenous factors. So that is hardwired, in our bodies. So genetics, epigenetics, and then also metabolomics, and also everybody's microbiome. So we want to encourage more research to study the relationship between the exposome and the genetic factors. We now have an office that is dealing with this research. It's called OneTalks. The office is not specifically focused on ALS. It's for all neurological diseases that are under the mission of NINDS, but we really hope that we can encourage investigators in the ALS field to submit application to these programs. And the one study out of the University of Michigan that I mentioned earlier that is already conducting this type of research. But we think this is an area of, a lot of promise. We want to see growth, and hopefully we can stimulate additional research projects by offering new funding opportunities in that arena. So next, another area where NINDS has, a lot of interest and also a pretty robust investment is in therapeutics development. And over the past few years, there certainly has been a lot of progress in developing novel sort of modalities for gene-based treatments. And so these are certainly of interest to the familial forms of ALS. And we have a couple of studies that look at FUS-linked ALS, at SOD1-linked ALS, and also at C9orf72-linked ALS. And sort of in the biomedical research field, new promising technologies are being developed. They have all sorts of names. There are antisense oligonucleotide strategies. There are new viral vector for gene therapies. And then also there are new technologies to edit the genome. And so it's called CRISPR-Cas approaches, and that allows you to modify the DNA in human cells. So these technologies, they're not ALS specific, but they're certainly something that ALS investigators are now harnessing and taking advantage of to develop new treatments for ALS. And since NINDS recognizes that there are huge opportunities for all neurological diseases, but especially also for ultra-rare diseases, where perhaps the private sector is a little bit reluctant to put big investment in because the patient numbers are small. So we felt that we as a federal agency should sort of fill that void and build programs that address rare diseases and also ultra-rare diseases. And certainly ALS is of really, is of great interest here. So we now have a new program. It's called URGENT, or Ultra-Rare Gene-Based Therapy Network. And so this program is just starting. We are beginning to get very strong applications. I think we're already funding perhaps 1 or 2 programs, nothing in ALS yet, but I know there's interest, and I hope that, within a year or 2, we also have some activities in the ALS space. And it's kind of an interesting program because on the one hand, it provides funding to the academic researchers, but it also provides resources and access to consultants to help them develop or to navigate preclinical drug development, as well as conduct first-in-human testing. So I think it's a really well-rounded program. I expect there will be a lot of interest and activity in the ALS space, and I'm really looking forward to sort of see funded projects in the near future. So to sort of let you know that, these advances can now be scientific literature. I just have snapshots from a couple of papers, although I'm very much aware of the fact this is not about scientific publications. This is about clinical trials and getting drugs to patients. But without the underlying research, you don't get the trials, and then you also don't get the approved drugs. So my first example is a paper for FUS-linked ALS out of Columbia University. So they're developing antisense oligonucleotides to silence FUS, which when mutated is toxic to motor neurons. So that's a really interesting study, and they're already now conducting small pilot trials. Another study here is from, that's actually out of industry. So this is from Biogen, and together with academic clinicians, and they are developing a similar strategy, also using these so-called antisense oligonucleotides to target mutant SOD1 protein. And these are drug-like molecules, but still administration has to be done intrathecally into the spinal cord. And I have to say, it hasn't been easy so far. They did an initial trial, and it sort of reported out without convincing efficacy, but they then extended the window of treatment, and now we are starting to get biomarker signals that look very, very promising that this treatment may be effective if you give it long enough, and probably also early enough, sort of at the time when the patient starts to show the first symptoms of disease. But there are additional efforts and parallel efforts also for C9orf72 linked ALS. And the one point, and so this is an example for a genome editing strategy, and that is out of the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And it's, as you can see, it's a big study. It's a very collaborative team. And I think this is, really an advanced technology with a lot of promise. But something that I really want to emphasize, although these gene-based therapies right now are predominantly used to test their efficacy in familial forms of ALS, this is also going to be applicable to sporadic ALS as soon as you identify a very robust therapeutic target. And one example that I wanted to give is, so over the years, we have learned that all or most patients with sporadic ALS have a very specific pathology, which is an aggregation of TDP43 protein. So there has been a lot of activity, sort of discovery research, to better understand what the aggregation of this protein does and what it means when the protein TDP43 can no longer conduct its normal physiological function in motor neurons. And what has come out of these studies is that downstream a number of other genes are being affected, and STAthmin2 is one of these genes. In people with TDP43 pathology, STAthmin2 is downregulated in motor neurons, and these are the cells that control voluntary movement. So there's now an understanding that STAthmin2 could be a very, very interesting target to modulate with these gene-based therapies in order to upregulate its levels in motor neurons. And there are now groups trying again these platform technologies, either antisense oligonucleotides or other ways to upregulate STAthmin2 in anyone who has TDP43 pathology, and that's the majority of sporadic patients. And there are a number of other genes that are now sort of emerging and rising to the top for sporadic ALS to be targeted with these gene-based strategies. So I think a lot of energy, a lot of activity, and I think a lot of promise. And certainly the ALS field is really benefiting for these technological advances that are across, actually across human disease. These are technology advancement that can be applied to any gene that is involved in a human disease. So now I'm going to switch gear a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the implementation of ACT for ALS. So as you know, this bill was signed into law in December 2021. And it's a complex law. It has multiple components, and I'm going to describe the law a little bit, and then also what we have done so far, because now it's been a year, and certainly we need to implement the law as fast as possible. And we are now in year 2, and of course implementation is continuing, and we're getting more money. So it's certainly a program that is going to grow. So one section or one component of this law asked NIH to build a grant program to fund research utilizing data from expanded access study. So we put out a solicitation last spring, and so far one study has been funded, and this is an expanded access protocol for intravenous trehalose to be given to patients. And the people who are eligible for these studies are people living with the disease who are no longer able to participate in trials because they don't meet the inclusion criteria that are typically used for clinical trials. And as I'm sure all of you know, to be eligible to participate in trial, the expectation is that you're still early in the disease. So this is something that neither NIH or FDA controls. It's the sponsors of these trials who set the inclusion criteria. But I guess understandably, they kind of want to test their investigational agents in people who are very early in the disease, because the idea is if the drug has an effect, it will be sort of more easier to measure in someone who is earlier in the disease than more progressed. So this project is out of Massachusetts General Hospital, but I should say they are using the clinical network of the Healy ALS platform program, and they're going to enroll at over 25 sites. And I think it's a well-oiled machine, the Healy ALS platform program. They are really good at what they're doing. And so their timeline is that they're going to start enrolling in the study in spring to 2023. So I think maybe in 2 months from now. The grant got funded back in September. They still had to get their IRB and finish another sort of administrative requirements, but now they're ready to start the project. And it's a really sort of a great team, and there's a lot of expertise there. Another component of the legislation asks for a public-private partnership to advance ALS research, specifically patient-focused drug development and some other important areas to sort of, I guess, improve clinical trial readiness in ALS. And this is a collaboration between the FDA. They're a little bit sort of in a leadership role here, as well as NIH, also PALS communities, advocacy groups, and also private entities. And this activity started at the end of September, and FDA is currently working with the Critical Path Institute to build a program to advance sort of regulatory science in the ALS field. This program is definitely going to grow, and we are already in conversations with the FDA, with CPATH, and also other stakeholders to sort of figure out how we can grow this program in ALS research. And I think there's going to be a lot of activity this year. And I think it's going to be a program that is going to include a lot of stakeholders. And NIH is certainly really excited about this program. And they have done similar things in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease together with the foundation of NIH. So hopefully there can be a lot of activity here. And then thirdly, another component of Act for ALS was to give support to the FDA for a rare neurodegenerative disease grant program. And so far, FDA, with money from Act for ALS, and it sort of got funneled through NIH, but it's an FDA grant. And that's a natural history study that is enrolling 1,700 participants. And it's going to do some really interesting research in terms of, you know, getting a really sort of detailed data about the progression of the disease. But they're also building prediction models that will in the future inform clinical trial design. So I think there is a lot of untapped potential here, and that's hopefully going to help us make future trials more efficient and also faster. And investment in telemedicine tools. And I think there are many lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. And I think that's ultimately going to lower the bars for clinical studies and increasing sort of access to these patients, access to these studies to patients across the board. So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about expanded access, because that's such an important component of Act for ALS. So as probably most of you know, expanded access is something that the FDA offers, and it's also heavily regulated by the FDA. So although NIH is going to fund these grants, sort of, I think a little bit FDA is calling the shots in terms of giving permissions to these studies. So I think the ALS, the problem in ALS is very well known. Most clinical trials only enroll study participants that are early in disease. And people living with the disease therefore often miss the eligibility window to participate in these trials. And so I've alluded that to this problem and sort of really serious gap already earlier. And so this is not only the case in ALS, it also is an issue in other diseases. And therefore, FDA has established this pathway for patients with a serious disease, and certainly ALS qualifies to get access to investigational medical products. So it can be a drug, it can be a biologic, and a biologic, for instance, that's a therapeutic antibody, or maybe a cell therapy, or even a medical device, to get access for treatment outside a clinical trial. And sometimes this is also called compassionate use. This program has been, available for many, many years, and ALS patients have always had access to it. But an issue is, of course, someone has to pay for it. And that's sort of a motivation for Act for ALS. So certainly large pharma oftentimes has enough money to provide expanded access. And I should mention, even the company Amelie, and they're not a large pharmaceutical company, they're, a small biotech. They had an expanded access program for Relivrio before it got approved, although that study probably wasn't big enough. But there's certainly some smaller companies that try to engage in that space. But still, it's expensive for companies, and it's sort of, an area where perhaps federal funding is going to be very helpful. And expanded access has, it's a little, there are some complexity, and certainly there are multiple stakeholders. And this is information straight from the FDA. I went to the website and sort of went through, their guidance. And I think they have some really good overview of the different roles and responsibilities. So at the center of it all is, of course, the patient. And the patient needs to work with a licensed physician and discuss options for expanded access treatments. Then the physician plays an important role because he or she has to agree to oversee the patient's treatment and also work with the producer of the medical product. So that can be a small biotech, it can be a large pharmaceutical company, but they need to be willing to provide the agent and either pay for it or find other ways to sponsor the study or the treatment. And then the company or the developer then also has to submit an expanded access request to FDA, or if they don't want to do it, they have to work with a clinician to submit that request to the FDA. And to submit that request, of course, the clinician needs information about the drug, for instance, safety information, things like that. And then there's also oversight by an investigational review board that will make sense and will make sure that both the expanded access protocol is in place and makes sense, and then also that the consent forms are appropriate, and make sure that the patient who is going to get the treatment is informed about the nature of the treatment and potential risks. And then finally, the FDA will review the expanded access request and, hopefully grant permission. And when we talked to the FDA, they said that they work on a very, very fast turnaround for these requests. Usually it takes less than a month. And that's probably quite different from their regular regulatory approval when they have a new drug application. So this is how it works. Many players, but I think there are exciting opportunities, and certainly something that NIH hasn't done before, but we are now going to get engaged in this space. Just need a sip of water. And this week's update is that just 2 days ago, we published our grant solicitation for expanded access studies for fiscal year 2023. The announcement was published on Tuesday this week, and now we are certainly hoping that we'll get a number of very strong and compelling applications. The application due date is towards the end of March, so this time the applicants have about 2.5 months time to prepare applications, but we do know that there are some restrictions and criteria in the law that means that not all the potential applicants will be able to submit application because the program is only open to small businesses. So large pharma cannot apply, and the justification for that is that large pharma should fund these studies themselves. They should not ask for NIH money because they are usually quite profitable as large pharmacy companies. And then also the agent already needs to be in a clinical trial, and specifically in a phase 3 clinical trial. And that is for sort of safety consideration, something that is still very early on in testing, is sometimes just too risky to make available through expanded access. So now I am going to switch gears again And I'm going to talk a little bit about our 2022 strategic planning process that is just about to wrap up. And this was a huge community effort. And although sort of NIH was leading it from a sort of organizational perspective, it was really the research community as well as the patient community that helped us sort of drive this and develop, I think, what now is a really sort of informative and exciting product. So we started about a year ago with a public request for information. We reached out to the public and asked what, in their view, are the gaps in ALS research and what are the untapped opportunities. And I think it was a really successful request for information because we got over 300 different responses, and they were all really high quality. Then we went through them and we summarized them, and actually Jane Hedinger, who is my colleague, she worked with another colleague at NINDS to go through each response, to categorize them, and then to pull them together in one sort of very coherent PDF document that is now posted at our website. And most importantly, that external feedback was given to all of the working groups that were engaged in developing priorities for ALS research. So that was sort of their base information to start the process. We then formed 5 different working groups that address different components of ALS research, spanning from basic research to clinical research. And they then met via teleconferences over a couple of months. And there also was a steering committee. And they then developed draft priorities, which were presented at a virtual meeting back in October. And that, again, was a public meeting. And there were good discussions about these priorities and a lot of feedback from attendees. And also there were sort of virtual open mic sessions. So there were listening sessions for NIH and working group members to see whether these draft priorities should be amended. And also then after the workshop, we posted them online so that the community had time to look them through and again, give us feedback to let us know, what are potential improvements, enhancement, addition to these priorities. That sort of public comment period ended just before the holidays. Now we got another round of really valuable comments, and the steering committee is currently working with the co-chairs of the working group to amend the recommendations and to get to a final product. And that final product, so 15 research priorities, is going to be presented to our advisory council. This is just something how NIH operates. And anything we do needs concurrence or approval by a group of really sort of outstanding scientists in the field to sort of give their blessing and allow us to move to the implementation phase. And that meeting is going to be on February 1st. Again, it's a virtual meeting and it's going to be available by webcast. So anyone is very welcome to tune in. We have a session during that meeting on February 1st. It's about 1.5 hours starting at 3:15, where we are going to discuss these research priorities. So just to let you know a little bit how we organized this effort, there was a steering committee composed of researchers, including clinician scientists, but also basic researchers, and then also people living with the disease, caregivers, and advocates. And it was really important to us to have patients involved throughout, and I think that was very successful. And I think it really sort of shaped the whole process. And then the steering committee was responsible for coordination, and they are now also going to present to council. And then we had 5 working groups, and as I mentioned earlier, they focused on different aspects of ALS research. There was one working group focusing more on sort of basic ALS research. We called it accelerating research on the biology behind ALS. And then we also had a working group that focused on therapy development in ALS. Then there was a working group that focused on clinical research and clinical trials. Then we had another working group looking at quality of life research. And I have to say that's something that's sometimes a little bit overlooked by NIH, and that's really a sort of an area with a lot of opportunities and where we probably are going to have increased engagement. And finally, there was a working group and that was charged with identifying opportunities for collaborations and partnerships. And I think in the ALS space, that's really important. Without partnership, things really get slowed down, and there are a lot of untapped opportunities here. So just to sort of summarize some of the key outcomes, I wanted to talk about some of the themes where there was a lot of consensus between the different working groups. And then also one important point that everybody agreed on, and that's the urgencies. We all know that ALS is a rapidly progressing disease and the ALS clock is ticking. So we need to spring into action. And then there were a couple of sort of cross-cutting research priorities that were identified by more than one working group. So one thing that I think everybody agreed on, that we really have to do better to sort of understand the clinical heterogeneity in ALS. And that's something that I already talked earlier about. The Create Consortium is also trying to address this. ALS looks different in different patients. And what does that tell us about the biology behind the disease? And what does it tell us about clinical trials, how we should run them, and what agents are going to be effective in different groups of ALS patients. Then there was also broad agreement that we should really refine our understanding of the progression of the disease. I think all groups agreed on that. There are already some studies ongoing, but more could be done, and there are sophisticated technologies becoming available that can be used in these studies. Everybody agreed that early treatment is essential, and to do that, we need to sort of expedite diagnosis and also understand when people with risk mutations for ALS are sort of getting into the stage when they are having their early symptoms. Then there was also consensus that we really need to build infrastructure that can be accessed by everybody. And the reason why this is so critical, because it doesn't only expedite sort of academic research, but it also brings industry into the field. If industry solid resources available to get engaged in the space, they are then willing to make investments in ALS research. And as I mentioned earlier, there are opportunities in quality of life research. And then also there was a really good understanding that we would need to get a better sense of the ethnic diversity, race, and gender on all aspects of the disease. And I think that's still a little bit understudied, and a lot more could be done. And then finally, another recommendation was that we need to ensure equitable access to all people living with ALS to clinical research and therapeutic trials. And that really needs to be independent of geographical location, and everything also has to be open to underserved people. So the next two slides have a lot of text, and these are the 15 priorities that came out of this planning effort, because each working group was charged to develop or to articulate 3 top priorities. And I mean, there is a lot of ground to cover, and 3 priorities doesn't seem a lot for these different modalities of ALS research, but we really wanted them to highlight those areas of opportunity that rise to the top and where most can be done. And what I wanted to emphasize here is that all of these priorities are something that NIH is, of course, going to listen to and use as guidance for future programs. But this is not just NIH specific. We hope that the ALS field as a whole will look at these priorities, and that other funders will then also start building progress to advance these priorities. So we hope that there'll be partnerships between NIH and other funders of ALS research to implement the objectives of this strategic planning effort. So on this slide, I have the first three working groups, basic, translational, and clinical research, and their top priorities. I think all of them are super exciting, and there are a lot of opportunities and also a lot of energy in the field, in the research community to move these areas of research forward if they get access to funding, of course. And then moving on, these are the other two working groups. So as I mentioned, quality of life got a lot of attention. I think it's very exciting and important. What can we do for patients who live with the disease right now, right? And then finally, the last working group is something that I think is going to be really important to NIH. And this is the question, how can we improve collaboration in the field of ALS research? And this is something that we have perhaps done for some other diseases, but a lot more can be done in ALS. And so, for instance, there was this recommendation to start building multimodal data platforms that are accessible to anyone who does ALS research, and to ensure that to allow meta-analyses across studies, that the data are harmonized and the data structure allows comparing or making data basically interoperable between different studies. Because I think right now there are already a lot of really excellent research studies ongoing, but sometimes they're a little bit segmented. They're led by different universities, and sometimes the data is not completely harmonized, which sort of slows or like is a hindrance to conduct larger studies that pulls data from different projects together to get, higher sample numbers and more compelling data. And then there was also a recommendation that we should have build bigger repositories for research tools, protocols, and resources. And so these are things like biobanks that will have biospecimens from patients. Again, we already have a number of resources, but more could be done. And again, the idea is to sort of to link these biobanks or repositories, and also to have an inventory of protocols that investigators, sometimes who may right now not work in ALS research, up and then have a lower hurdle to sort of get into the ALS space and start new projects in ALS research. And then another, important recommendation, which I think is very much in tune of what Act for ALS is calling for. This is the concept of, collaborations across academia, government, and industry partners. So sort of public-private partnership. And I think a lot can be done in this space. And I think both academic investigators are really interested in collaborating with industry. And on the other hand, industry researchers want to collaborate with academicians and clinical research who already work with patients and understand the disease to de-risk their investment in therapeutic development. And I think NIH can be a convener here. We've done it for other diseases, and we work with the foundation of NIH for a number of diseases, and we can see the opportunities and the way it can accelerate disease fields. It's been done, for instance, in diabetes and in other more common diseases, but there's certainly a lot of opportunities in ALS. So this is, I'm almost at the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to insert one slide describing this new study that NIH has commissioned with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to conduct a study on research care and services for ALS. And this is actually something that Congress is very interested in. And we have done these type of studies for other diseases and other sort of research questions. And we just initiated that at the very end of calendar year 2022. So NASM is going to do this study a little bit independent of NIH. They got money for us, but we really want them to do their own work and recruit experts that they feel they need to develop recommendations for ALS research, care, and services, and then do that process a little bit independent of us, but then provide these recommendations to NIH as guidance for future programs. And I mean, you may think this is very similar to the ALS strategic plan, and certainly there are some overlap, but this is going to build on the ALS strategic plan. So we gave our draft priorities from the strategic plan to NASM, and they are now going to further discuss them with experts in the field, and then going to also move more into ALS care and provision of services for people living with ALS. So right now they're still at the beginning stages. They are compiling a committee of experts, and we don't have the names yet. I think it's still ongoing, but certainly they are going to recruit people who are scientific experts of ALS, but also more general experts in therapy development. So perhaps not just ALS specific, but really understand what it takes to successfully develop drugs. And then also experts in healthcare services and support, as well as delivery and access. And then finally, again, people who are living with ALS will be engaged in this process. NASM is collecting these individuals, and they have a sort of a really good process for doing this. They have done this for many other studies, and we are now letting them do the work. We have monthly calls with them to sort of track progress, but we want them to work relatively independently, and we are really looking forward to these recommendations. And these recommendations will certainly be important and advisory to NIH, but also to a couple of other government agencies that are part of the ALS ecosystem. So certainly also FDA, but certainly probably also CMS and some other agencies. And so this sort of brings me to my last slide. All I can say is that I expect that 2023 will be very, very busy. It's already been busy over the last 10 days with a new grant solicitation and other activities. And we are now gearing up to also bring our strategic plan to a close. But that just means sort of finalizing the draft priorities. And that then means the next step is implementation. And that, of course, will where sort of the action starts. And we are looking forward to that. And here we think we will be collaborating with other funders and also all the nonprofit groups in the field. And then also, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we are already funding $120 million of ALS research. So of course, we don't want to have any of these programs drop off. We want to expand these programs and also accelerate these programs. So we will continue our current investment, and we hopefully will be able to build new programs that are aligned with the priorities that the community developed for us through the strategic planning effort, but then also which are aligned to components of ACT4ALS. So lots of activity, and since the ALS clock is ticking, the message from NIH to the research community is to apply now. We can only fund research if we have applications. And although we don't have many ALS-specific grant solicitation, we have a lot of funding opportunity announcements on the street that are open to ALS research. And I should emphasize that of the $120 million, most of this research is funded through our general funding opportunity announcements. And we have at NINDS specific announcements, for instance, for clinical trials, we offer a very robust clinical trial network that certainly can do ALS studies. We have a number of announcements for biomarker research and for therapy development. And then we also have very general announcements for basic research. All of these programs are open and active, and we need investigators to apply. And certainly we are going to pay a lot of attention to ALS research, and we want to fund as many applications as we can. We don't limit our investment. However, it depends, of course, on the overall NIH appropriations from Congress. And then also it always depends on the number of meritorious applications we receive. So as a program director, I'm really excited that the ALS research community is of really high quality. Applications do very well in peer review. And also, I think it's a very sort of energized community. And we have a lot of young researchers getting excited about ALS research because of the scientific opportunities that are developing. So I'll close here, and I'm open to any questions. And I just put my contact email at the bottom of the email. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll either me or one of my colleagues that are also supporting some of our ALS programs will respond to you. And we also have a communications office that sometimes help us with reaching out to the the broader community. So I see that Randy Fishman has hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank you, for the committee and all the work you've done. This is very exciting and informative. And I think your presentation was just spot on perfect. So I have a couple questions, just a little background. My husband passed from ALS about 6 years ago. And I submitted a petition. And so I'm kind of curious about the whole process. I tried to write down the site that you mentioned now has gone through all the public comments, and you've narrowed it down to what your new priorities are. But just back up a little bit. So I submitted, and many people on this webinar signed the petition to ask for, in this study, to also include respiratory care research in the grant. And I'm just curious if you might be, and also a group of pulmonary physicians that I know and work closely with, I know they also submitted a letter during the public timeline before December to ask for funding and research grants and et cetera about that. So I'm curious, because I can't go on this news site at the same time of watching this to see if the committee has accepted that and what's the plan going forward. I'm sorry, that was very long.
Glad that you brought that up. And I've seen that feedback that we received, and our ears are wide open. So the public comment period ended in mid-December. So we then pulled all the comments together and we sent them to the working groups. And that was something that we actually paid a lot of attention to. And I actually discussed it with already a couple of colleagues at NINDS. So since this sort of falls under the sort of area of quality of life research, the quality of life working group is very much aware of that. They looked at that recommendation, and they're currently revising the priorities, I think, to include it. I haven't seen their revision. I know Jane Hedinger, my colleague at NINDS, is sort of the facilitator for that working group. I don't know whether Jane is on, but I talked to her earlier today. She was hoping to join, but I know we already past 8 p.m. at the East Coast. And sorry for overrunning my time. But certainly they listened to that, they got the response, and the charge to that working group is to build that into the recommendation. I haven't seen the revision yet, so they're still, they didn't have it to submit it yet, but sort of the final version will be ready on February 1st. So I haven't seen it yet, but we are aware of it. And I think that's actually a really interesting sort of area of opportunity. And also, I think also because of the COVID pandemic, there actually have been some advances in respiratory care. And the question is, can we leverage some of these advances for ALS? And I think it's a really interesting area, and it's, you know, really important aspect of patient care. So thank you for bringing this to our attention. And this is why it was so important for us to get these comments from, you know, the broader ALS community.
Yes.
So thank you for submitting it.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your comments and interest in providing that and including it going forward. But
Thank you,
just
Randy, for that question. Did you
yeah,
have one?
no, I just wanted to just say one other very quick little thing, Nina, is just to, if there's, if you can please post again, the website was quite long. I couldn't write it down quickly.
I know.
Where then the final things are going to be. So I just want to check back and also just one other super quick thing is, so you mentioned in the introduction that Dr. Gubitz is also at Penn. Is that correct? Or you were there?
I did postdoctoral research there.
Yeah.
I did work at a research assistant professor. But I have to say, I worked in a lab focused on spinal muscular atrophy on ALS, but it's another neuron disease, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I did my academic research.
Okay. No, I'm only because two of the pulmonary physicians that also wrote and sent in a long petition happened to be at Penn.
Yes, I noticed that. Yeah, I noticed.
Okay, great.
Certainly,
okay, terrific.
Yeah,
so thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Randy, for those questions. Now, Amelie, I would love to ask you, do you have a hard stop, or could we ask you maybe 15 minutes?
I'm good till midnight. I'm fine.
Okay, so we'll go for another 15 minutes asking you some of the questions from our Q&A. And then perhaps after we can send them to you and you can respond, but I'll have Grace and Olivia take the lead here. And so they are research fellows, but I'll let them go ahead and take the lead. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to start us off. I'm Grace from the beginning of this meeting. So one of the first questions that we had early in the presentation was, so there is only one interventional trial, the HERV-K trial at the NIH Clinical Center. And do you see that expanding in the future?
Okay, so I have to say, so this is an intramural lab, and I'm at the extramural part of NINDS, and there's actually a little bit of a firewall between those two parts of NIH, intramural versus extramural. I mean, we try to be collaborative, but I can't tell them what's going on in the extramural labs with too much detail, and sometimes I don't really know exactly the state of their research. It's possible, so it's Avinath, right, who is leading that study. Please reach out to Avinath. I can provide that email, but he would be able to speak to that study and sort of see whether they're still enrolling and expanding. I think it's a really interesting study. It's not part of my portfolio because it's a different pot of money. It's an intramural lab, but I can sort of connect you and you know, provide Avi's email. I'm sure he would be, you know, really happy to respond. It's sort of an organizational issue. Each of the institutes has an intramural component, an extramural component, and we work a little bit separately because I sort of communicate with a lot of researchers outside NINDS across the country. That's more of my role. So sorry.
Thank you. So the next question is, what are your thoughts on starting interventions early or pre-symptomatically for helping in the progression of the disease? Again, this is only possible if ALS is diagnosed early.
Right. So this is something that was, you know, intensely discussed during the strategic planning effort. I think a couple of the working groups felt that this is, you know, a really important area. These fund research in, so we fund studies in, for instance, one study is called PREFALS. So it's a study out of the University of Miami of gene mutation carriers. And they're conducting studies to get better signals that predict phenoconversion. And I mean, it's up to the FDA, right, what they would allow in terms of starting a clinical trial. But I actually looked at clinicaltrials.gov very recently. And there are 1 or 2 pre-symptomatic study, I think on SOD1-linked ALS, perhaps, maybe also in C9, but certainly I have the feeling that the clinical researchers and also industry recognize how important that may be and are sort of moving into that direction for the familial forms of the disease. We are sort of funding research to enable these studies by finding markers for conversion from, being healthy and getting the disease in people who carry these risk genes. So huge opportunity, really exciting area. And I think certainly the field is moving into that direction.
Absolutely, a lot of exciting stuff going on. So our next question is, has the NIH looked into studies on longevity comparison, such as studies comparing those who survive less than 5 years with those who survive over 10 and 20 years with ALS?
Right, so that's also, that's sort of the clinical heterogeneity of the disease, which is still kind of poorly understood, right? So we are funding a number of natural history study to then also understand what are, the molecular signatures in biofluids in these patients. What can we learn about the, mechanism of the disease? What differentiates the disease in a patient where the progression is slower versus faster? So there are active research efforts. Certainly the Create Consortium is conducting a lot of research in that arena. They wanted to investigate what we call genotype-phenotype correlation. So is the genomic makeup in people who progress faster different from those who progress more slowly? Are there protective genes? Things like that. So that's a really important area of research. We are invested, but other studies are also doing that. I think also the ALS, the Answer ALS Consortium, it's privately funded. They also sort of do these type of studies. Important area of research and certainly a need to better understand that.
So our next question is if you could expand on how the NIH is committed to prophylactic treatment of pre-manifest genetic carriers of ALS or frontotemporal dementia.
Right, so that's sort of similar to sort of very early treatment, and then in familial cases, the next step would be what can we do in terms of prophylactic treatment. So far we don't have, we're not funding prophylactic studies. It's maybe a little bit too early. That I think in the future it's certainly something that may sort of become available. Again, the FDA would agree and agree to it, and also give permission to do trials in people who are still healthy. But it's something that we are paying attention to, something that we are trying to understand, and also something that you probably could also then first test in animal models of familial forms of ALS, treat an animal model early, see whether it pushes disease onset back. But of course, we want to then make that available to people who are at risk for ALS. So we're not doing it yet. There's a lot of interest, and I could see that some of our animal model studies could sort of inform these type of approaches.
Absolutely. So we've been talking a lot about genetic factors, and this next question asks, with the significant challenges of understanding the causes and variations of ALS, do you see a large, robust natural history study as being foundational to move on with that work or with different work?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really important activity. And the FDA is now funding a natural history study with 1,700 participants across 10 sites. Let me see, I had written it down. It's out of the University of Minnesota. It's David Walk is the principal investigator of that study. So that's one very large study. And we have a couple of natural history studies. But I think if you do these studies, you also kind of want to drill down and not only sort of observe phenotypes, but capture as much data as you can. And that includes imaging data and also, I think, analyzing biofluids and also then, using some of these advanced outcome measures, such as voice recordings. So I think if you do these studies, the more data rich you can make these studies, the more valuable they will be. So just sort of observing and taking ALS functional rating scale measurements, it's probably not going to be enough. I would want to see sort of a deeper dive in all aspects of the disease, including biofluids analysis, including imaging, and also, as I said, some of these more advanced outcome measures. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity. And I should say there are also a couple of studies in Europe, of course, and in Asia. So I think it's also important to pay attention that these studies are interoperable so that you can pull large data sets together, because that'll give you more statistical power to sort of, get more information out of these studies.
Could you comment more about what the NIH is doing to promote data aggregation across like projects like Create, ProAct, and like UMichigan?
Okay, so this is an area of intense focus, and actually NIH just rolled out a new data sharing policy, and this is an area where we want to become very active. So we have a solicitation out for data harmonization efforts, and I can't talk about a funded project yet because the notice of award has to be on the road, but certainly there is future activity that I expect will start in 2023. And there is, a lot of opportunity, I think, in the ALS field. And certainly we have a specific grant solicitation on the street that will fund this type of research. And we have done it for some other, diseases and conditions already. For instance, I think there's a big effort in traumatic brain injury and some other diseases, but more could be done in ALS. And I hope we are going to increase our investment for sure. That's an area of growth.
Absolutely. Our next question is, if a new drug shows significant survival benefit, can someone move fast into human studies or show significant survival benefit in mice or an animal model? Can someone move fast into human studies, or does the investigator need more data to move into human studies? What does that process look like pretty much overall?
Yeah, so that's actually a process that's regulated by the FDA. So if an investigator has preclinical data for a candidate therapeutic, before they can start giving that agent to humans, they have to get an investigation new drug application approved. And I mean, this is just, they need safety and tox data out of various animal models. It's something that is regulated by the FDA. It's, across all diseases, there are certain standards that they expect, but researchers and, oftentimes it's industry researchers, they are very familiar with these requirements and work with the FDA. However, we at NINDS, we fund so-called IND enabling research study. So these are these are research studies to get to this to sort of cross the bar to get approval to test these new agents in humans. And typically IND enabling studies include safety and toxicology studies, and they're done in animal models, and sometimes some of it is done in cell models. But we have funding for this type of work, but we don't regulate it. It's something that the FDA oversees.
So the next question is asking you, what are your thoughts on drugs being approved based on the ALFRS or based on survival?
So, I mean, I should say I'm not a clinician, and so maybe that's not that's where I would want one of my colleagues to weigh in. I mean, I know that's currently the standard, but maybe it's not as sensitive. as we wish we want it to be. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit crude. I mean, certainly if something works really, really well, you'll see it on the ALS functional rating scale. And also the rating scale, of course, has a lot of relevance to daily living. So I think it's a very useful tool. It's a nice by the FDA, but we probably could do better. And maybe there should be other outcome measures and biomarkers included. But I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a clinician. I oversee mostly basic research. But again, out of the recommendations, take a look at them once they're finalized, or listen to our, council meeting to that session. We had a working group focusing on these type of questions. And the working group had clinician scientists as well as, people with ALS, but they sort of looked that over. And I think there's some interesting recommendations coming out.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Gubitz. So we're right around passing 8:30. We have about 10 more questions left. Do you feel good to keep going, or we want to be respectful of your time and everybody's time?
Let's do 3 more and then we'll wrap up.
That sounds good.
And as I said, the clinical questions are a little tough for me because I'm not a neurologist, so.
That is all right. And maybe with the remaining questions, would you be okay with us maybe sending them to you, and we could send out an email of response?
Absolutely. Yes, and then I can also work, depending on the topic of the question, work with some of my colleagues, because as I really want to emphasize, it's sort of a team at NINDS, and we have, experts in therapy development and clinical experts, and it's always more than one person. So
absolutely, team effort. Yeah. Okay, so our next question is regarding the NINDS strategic plan for ALS. How are you planning to measure success in that?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Actually, our steering committee already brought that up. And, they sort of said, who takes ownership of the plan and makes sure that it gets implemented. So all I can say, this plan is not going to sit on the shelf and collect dust. And we don't have a formal process yet, but we have started discussions how to best do it. And, there are models from a couple of other